This is Reimagining Higher Education, your go-to podcast with remarkable education leaders sharing personal stories from their experience in and around the sector, including reflection and evidence for progress in the sector. With your host, Professor Judyth Sachs, former PVC Learning and Teaching at the University of Sydney, Deputy Vice Chancellor and Provost at Macquarie University, and Special Advisor in Higher Education at KPMG, and now Chief Academic Officer at Studiosity. Welcome.
It gives me great pleasure to introduce you to David Lloyd, Vice Chancellor of University of South Australia, who has been, how long have you been at the University of South Australia now? 8 years? And so, right, and so long-standing, visionary Vice Chancellor who certainly did reimagine higher education, reimagined University of South Australia. So I'm looking forward to hearing your story of that reimagination and your ideas about the future reimagining of higher education in Australia. But before we start, I would like to acknowledge that I am on Indigenous land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation in Sydney, and I wish to pay my respects to elders past and present. And I also wish to acknowledge that Studiosity recognises the traditional owners and custodians throughout Australia and the lands where we work, and recognises their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. And we pay our respects to elders past and present. So David, what is your object?
Well, thanks, Judy. I'm on Carter country today. What I brought, the far side cartoon.
Yes. You might have to read it to us.
It's a very famous far side cartoon of two chimps sitting on the bough of a tree, and one chimp is grooming up the village and says, well, another blonde hair. Doing a little more research with that Jane Goodall tramp. And I had it signed by Jane Goodall, and it says, for David, what is this life without a sense of humour? This, for me, represents my education journey. I think what we do is very serious, but I don't think we should take ourselves very seriously. And it was my pleasure to meet Jane in 2014 when we gave her an honorary doctorate. And I talked about the impact of that on fundraising for her. So the Fireside cartoon was out for a very long time, and Jane actually then used it as part of the Jane Goodall Institute for fundraising. But really, what you said to me was, why not turn something which everyone loved into something that you can actually generate revenue and resource from? And for me, I think being in education is a job I love, but I also think it's a job where you have a lot of fun. And I think for me, the journey has been to always kind of instill the team and the organisation, not with a sense of irreverence, but at least a sense of not being overly serious in its bearing, but being willing to actually take a chance, be able to take a risk, being able to learn from mistakes, but also being able to convey the fact that learning is adventure and education is adventure. And that to me is why the gig is fun. It's a privilege to do. So can you tell us about your own education, both as an undergraduate and a postgraduate student? Yeah, so I finished my equivalent of U12 in Ireland in 1991, and I was 17 years old, and we have the same equivalent. We have a central tertiary admission centre in Ireland, the CAO, and it was a big, epic, to fill in the form for the CAO. It was kind of a rite of passage. I'm first in family to attend higher education, and I remember filling in the form. I'd always wanted to be a scientist, and I was pretty bright, but it was a kind of a new venture for anybody in my family to attend university. And we had the form, and my father said to me, put down Trinity College, it's a really good university. And my mum said, put down Dublin City University, TCU, because you can come home for your lunch. And TCU went down as the number one choice on my CAL form, because literally I could walk to the university and come home for lunch. It was a mechanism. I didn't have to take the bus into the city. And that's how the city was economical. And similarly, I knew a couple of people who were going to go to DCU from my year group. So it was trying to have that familiar sense. I took on a degree of analytical science, my principal undergraduate degree, and about 6 weeks into it, I realised I made the wrong choice. I found it very limiting in the way in which it was going to enable my career. I wanted to be a scientist, and this was really set me up to be a very narrow, specific analyst. And the university was about to introduce a second year, a new degree program in applied chemistry. It was going to have the same first year as analytical science and biotechnology degree. So I convinced them to allow me and a number of my classmates to jump from the end of our first year in analytical science into the second year of applied chemistry. And we became the first cohort of applied chemists. Small groups, there were only 12 people in my year group, so it was a very small, bespoke education. We were guinea pigs in many ways because it was a brand new program. And now I know that programs are geared to that. I think that they had a feel for what they were going to do, but they hadn't got it all ready as it rolled out. And towards the end of that, I was asked by one of the lecturers if I wanted to do a PhD. It was an honours degree program, a graduate program. And I said, I do, but I don't want to just do a chemistry PhD. Sorry, it's just very loud. I'm going to go past here. I don't want to just do a broad chemistry degree. I'd like to see where what I make translates into something tangible. And he said, okay, well, I'll supervise you to do kind of, if you come up with a decent proposal, I'll supervise you. And so I did a PhD in anti-malarial drug design. And we produced molecules, and we modeled them up, I synthesized them, and we got them tested by the World Health Organization. Some of them worked, some didn't work. And many of them didn't work the way we thought they would. But I began to understand how drug discovery really worked using computer-aided methods. And so it was the early days of rational drug discovery. And that took me on a career into the pharmaceutical industry and postdocs. And then eventually found myself in a position as a lecturer in Trinity College.
So how did you find yourself into senior leadership roles?
I'm an accidental Vice Chancellor, I think. So I had gone into the pharmaceutical industry after I postdoced, and I went to Cambridge. I worked in industry in Cambridge in the UK. And really it was because there weren't many people working in the field that I worked in, and I wanted to learn more about it. It was a very applied industrial area. So when I came back, I was offered a role in Trinity. It was the Hitachi lectureship in advanced computing. That was a funded research position, which meant I had a lab, had an income stream, and I didn't have to teach, so it was a research-focused position. And because I'd come back from industry, the Irish economy has got, well, that's actually two major pillars: biotechnology and information computing technology, bio and ICT. And in the bio side of the house, there was a push to develop biopharmaceuticals. So a lot of big pharma companies have very major plans there. The Irish government wanted to invest in training facilities, education training facilities for that specific niche area of biopharmaceuticals. Somebody stuck their head around the door in my office and said, "You work in the pharmaceutical industry, can you go along to this meeting about biopharmaceuticals?" I did. I was a lecturer, level B. I think I was 31 at the stage. And I went to this meeting where everybody else in the room was the Deputy Vice Chancellor of Research, except for me. And I was the only one who actually worked in industry. And they were having a conversation about how best to structure this new enterprise. And I just didn't think it was particularly contemporary. Talking to somebody who sat beside me about my views on it. And then we collectively wrote a competing bid for the creation of the institute, and we won. So I fell into senior leadership because the president of the university called me after we won this major grant. He said, "You've got a bit of a knack for this industry engagement thing. Perhaps you could take on that role." So I became Trinity College's first Associate Dean of Research and Enterprise at the age of 31. And he said to me, "You're going to have to make a choice between your academic career and kind of both." And I tried to do both for the next 10 years. I tried to keep the lab and the management working in unison. It's very difficult when you've got a burn rate of $1 million a year to grab a group of about 70 people trying to write grants and the TBCR that became over that time. So when I came down to UniSA, I think I come up my lab last time.
So, given your description of yourself as an accidental Vice Chancellor. You are actually unique in having that business experience. So has that business experience shaped some of the ways that you think about universities and how you think about the role of a Vice Chancellor?
To some extent it has. I mean, as a researcher, biggest research collaborations was with IBM. And so IBM in the US was IBM Research in Alberta. And I would go to California every year for 3 or 4 weeks and work with a group on algorithms which we were using for drug discovery. And what I noticed was when you were in IBM, you were in IBM. You weren't somebody who worked in the department of molecular mechanics in the group of quantum biology sort of thing. You were actually in the blue pages was between you and the outside world. You were actually immersed in the corporate identity of the company. And I like that everyone's actually sort of working towards a small part of a larger goal. And so I noticed that as an academic leader, oftentimes it's a kind of what I used to describe my previous institution as a collection of sole traders who were all around. And there wasn't that unified identity. It was an identity with the organisation, but not an identity for the organisation. So when I took on the role here, I felt it was, because it was a new university, I felt it was more malleable than some of the older institutions, which tend to atrophy over time. And I also felt that if I could create a sense of identity where people were working for a purpose, and that purpose was, they could see themselves in the success of the organisation, I would get more out of it. So UniSA then for me became one where I tried to break down the notion of not only the disciplines, but the units, the departments. And now we have 7 academic units. We don't have schools, we don't have departments, we don't have divisions. We've got 7 academic units, and every single one is called UniSA, something like UniSA Creative, UniSA Business. So they work for the university, not just in it. And I think that's something I got from the time in industry, that identity with the organisation.
And it still was a very radical reimagining. And in many respects, for many people, they didn't quite understand what you were trying to get at, whereas the outcome was actually visionary. But the journey there has been challenging for some people.
Yeah.
What have you learnt from this process?
One of the deficits in any national system is the treatment of the tertiary education or higher education sector as a homogenous unit. It's not. It is diverse, and institutions have their own characteristics, goals, they have differences in their acts, they have different flavours of focus, and yet they are treated homogenously from a funding mechanism perspective and also from a perception perspective. There's a perception that everybody who leaves school at year 12 is heading on the university trajectory. Whereas I argue that over half of my students are not school leavers, and that I know that of 8,000 students, 2/3 of them are outside of South Australia who are in our online offering. And I have more first family and low SES than some of my near neighbours. And I also have a very unabashed industry applied agenda in terms of the contemporary nature of the curriculum and the connection to our industry partners, which defines the ethos of the organisation. So in that regard, when a one-size-fits-all policy ground doesn't support my institution to be differentiated, whereas the hope would be that it will be. Now, when I set about saying what kind of institution UniSA was going to be, I realised that some people will want to go on that journey, some people won't. But I also figured that I want people to identify with that type of journey and choose to take their talents to the organisation. We introduced attributes. They were on the wall behind the form. We introduced a whole series of attributes which we select staff for. We screen for type. Now, I don't want to have just kind of group think and everybody's a clone of each other. So we have all the regular percentages that have different perspectives at the table. But those attributes define the types of people we want. And you have to you actually have to succeed in demonstrating those attributes to be promoted in the organisation. It's not good enough to just have 10 nature papers and a lot of grants. You also have to actually be corporately fit to the institution. And that's a differentiator for us. And my view was, if you don't like it, You can work in 39 other institutions that have a different ethos.
In a context like Adelaide, where you've got 3 different universities that were established at 3 different moments in the higher education endeavour in Australia, UniSA stands out as being quite different. Was that also what drove you in terms of your shaping UniSA as it is?
Yeah, to a certain extent. I think the most, personal reason was identifying with the institution as being very much like the institution I attended. So when I went to DCU, it was a brand new university. It had only been a university for 3 years, and it was the university you went to get a job. And when I looked at the demographic of the UniSA students, the alignment among the professions, the fact that it was about enabling participation and equity, I had a very strong personal resonance with that. And I feel that it was that sense of identity. I mean, I said to my previous school principal, who was the secretary of Dublin City University at the time, I feel like I've actually just come back to the campus. It was that kind of tangible connection. So that's something for me which I guess drove my engagement, not maintaining that sense of openness which Denise Bradley really put in place when she was the Vice Chancellor here about equity. But equity and access is written into the university's Foundation Act. The commitment to Aboriginal education is in the Universities Act. It's the first institution to have reconciliation statements. UniSA has pedigree and a history of doing these things, and they resonated and I identified with them. So amplifying them became the logical thing to do. Not to be, I said at the time, it was a great schizophrenia. When I joined the uni, it was 25 years old. No, we were 25. We were only 21 years old. 21 years old when I joined. And it was almost Pinocchio-like feeling. I wanted to be a real university. So it needed to have all the things that a real university had. Whereas I was saying, actually youth here is an advantage. It's an opportunity to lay down our own trajectory and not emulate everybody's, to take on and own that space. So for now, in the last 10 years, we've been the most industry-engaged university in Australia. So to really step into that space in a big way. We're second in Australia for graduate employment, like the University of South Australia. But that's a phenomenal achievement. To really say that these are the things we value. And it's about making sure that our education outcomes are great and our research is connected to our partners. So it was easy for me in that regard because I felt like, as I said, I'd actually come back to my own institution.
So I'm hearing the words equity, participation and inclusion. Are these important things that drive you as a leader and as an educator? And what else drives you in your role?
Yeah, I really do feel, that I attended university is, to be first in family is an unusual step because it was something that was an expectation that maybe that it would not happen because there was no role model for it in the family. So going to university and then finding yourself as a Vice Chancellor is kind of an unusual, career path. I wouldn't have sat down at the age of 10 and said, you're going to run universities this way. The way in which I can see how equity and participation. Participation is not good. Success and outcomes are more important than participation because they're not the same thing. So I've recalibrated the lens towards outcomes and success rather than just participation or numbers. But when you do graduate people who've never felt they will be able to, or that they have no role model to emulate, they become the role model and they encourage others. We've now got second and third generation UniSA students starting to come through, and South Australian Institute of Technology students who've come through before. And you can see now that it's becoming expected that they will, and they go on to greater success. So we know the financial impact that the university education has. For me though, it's about making sure that it's about excellence as well. So equity shouldn't be about lowering your standards. It should be about ensuring that anybody with capacity to be a successful learner is afforded the access to be able to do that. And it doesn't matter whether you're from a fee-paying school or from a public school. If you've got the capacity, there should be a pathway for you. So when we have a UniSA college, which actually puts in place bachelor degrees, articulation pathways eternally for those who have got year 12. But I'm increasingly of a mind to try and move away from ATARs to look at other mechanisms to identify the potential for students and to allow them, the headspace that they need to flourish through education. And similarly, the research that you do needs to be, I would say, not only contemporary but partnered research, and that partnered excellence is really important. So on both sides of the equation, you deal with an accessible institution. So like if I deal with a pharma company or an IT company, they'll find us easy to do business with, but they'll do business at a level which is got a very high bar in terms of the quality of the evidence.
In focusing on the inclusiveness and pathways and participation, it does require that universities are organised in ways that are student-centred and support students. How best can we ensure that students are successful? Because we can get them in, but then we have to graduate them and we have to ensure that they can get jobs. So what's happening at UniSA to do that?
Yeah, I guess I wouldn't say it's not our responsibility to graduate them or to ensure that they get jobs. I think there's a responsibility to ensure that you don't over-enroll, so that you're not producing lots of graduates who are going into areas where there's no opportunity for them. And in terms of graduating, it's about ensuring that you're enabling them to be successful within the limits of capability and qualification. So when I look at the way we approach this, we spend a lot of time looking at first year attrition rates courses programs. We do interventions based on their analytics. We will put students back into courses and supports if they need them. And then we'll use exit awards as well. If the student is not geared to have a full degree qualification, we'll try and make sure that the investment they've made in seeking out their education to that point is not actually based in that way. But we keep a weather eye on both skills requirements, but also employment trends. So we started law school here 11 years ago, started 11 and a half before I became on board. And the university took a lot of flack for starting another law school in a market which already had two new neighbours. But within 7 years, ours was already the top ranked law school of the three at the times higher. And it was producing graduates who went on to employment because the numbers were small. They were practically oriented. They could walk out the door and write a brief. So they had a skill set that was pro-employment, pro-qualification, and which speaks to the way in which we gear our curriculum. So having and I keep using this word contemporary, having a contemporary curriculum which is industry informed or end user informed will make your graduates employable. Then not overproducing, doing it for the good of the graduates, but also for the economics of the institutions. And this is the second most important place. It's reasonably. You need to make sure you've got a good offering and then a good cohort.
In South Australia, you've got a relatively new government, and federally, we've got a new government, both of the same colour.
Yeah.
What's your sense of what that will mean with two Labor governments, state and federal? What will that mean for higher education, both nationally but also locally?
Well, I'm on my, I think it's my 11th Minister for Education, federal education. So I'd like to see some stickiness in the role. I'd like to see some longevity in the role. I think Labour at a federal level have been very, very clear that they intend to look root and branch at all elements of higher education. And that goes back to review the JRG, but also goes back to the core mechanisms of how they intend to see and maybe get to that point of stimulating and supporting differentiation in the sector over time. So I know the Minister made reference to the Bradley Review as having unfinished business. So I can see that there will be policy levers which will align to both participation but moreover success. And I hope in some way the support of, let's say, a differentiated mission-based across institutions in Australia. Primary concern is the majority of our supports are federal supports from the public funding and the
So you mentioned a bit earlier also that the need for more diversity in higher education, but you also said that so many universities have law schools, business schools, engineering, and more are getting medical schools. So how do you get that sort of diversity where in fact the structures are pretty similar, the acts have sort of local variation, and the strategies are pretty similar?
There's a few different layers to that, Judyth. I mean, in terms of strategies, there's a great homogeneity of university strategies, which basically says students, quality, excellence. And when we did our strategy, the first one under my tenure, we crowdsourced what we wanted to do from within the organisation. That led to a very, individualistic strategy. So the university said we're going to do the following things, and there were actions. They weren't kind of great statements of motherhood and apple pie. They were definitive actions that were taken to move the dial from point A to point B. So our more kind of corporate style strategy, and that crowdsourcing became more popular in the way in which strategies are being derived. The acts, the acts are already written. So unless the acts are amended, you're not going to get diversification into the system. So ours has equity and access participation into it because somebody had the foresight in 1990 to do that. The factors around diversity will come at the report, and I think it will come at the funding model as well. It could come at the it was the coalition wandered into the space. It didn't really translate into a massive change in operation, but it goes back to performance-based funding or performance-based incentivization of the sector. Wherein if you've got, let's say, we'll pick on medical schools, you've got 24 medical schools. Well, let's look at the quality of graduates that are produced through a lens of employability, through a lens of regionality, where they go, when they work, who's sticky, who's retained, and be able to, in some way, incentivize or reward the better performing groups within there to actually have more students, so that the less viable pieces are not just also ran. And I do believe that if the funding model is to be opened up, in some way linking the funding model to an equitable arrangement where everybody gets supported to the same quantum to attend, no matter what program they want to do. The idea that there's a market driver in student choice around fees is nonsense. But however, if a student's going to incur a debt beyond that, well, that then should be linked to the quality and the outcomes of the degree program. And I think if we can derive some metric there, we've got different percentiles of evaluation which link to employability and satisfaction, then you'll see differentiation as institutions will focus on what they're good at and drive a national market.
So if you could change anything for students that would help them to be successful, what would you do? Or what are you doing?
Well, I can tell you the one thing I'm working on. To try and remove extent for Aboriginal students would be top of my list. That's the last barrier to success and participation, and I can say we have a lot of supports in place for pathways, for scholarships, but they don't eliminate the accrual of debt over time, and the impact of debt on that cohort of students cannot be overestimated or overstated. It is really a significant consideration which deters participation. So if you get rid of that, see what it does to participation. I have a theory that we would move the dial, and so we see the graduation of students in domains that we haven't seen. I know that in 31 years of pharmacy in South Australia through the University of South Australia, we've had one or two Aboriginal graduates in pharmacy. If you think about every single pharmacy chain, national chains who all have reps who want to employ graduate pharmacists, we're never going to satisfy that requirement. So linking the employment requirements for allowing participation in the marketplace employment back to the elimination of service makes sense to me. It's a social experiment. Let's see what difference it makes. So that is one. The other one will be to normalise the support that they get from the government. I think it should be everyone should get the same amount. They should be able to spend it as they want. If you want to do a single course enrollment, to a degree, you have a certain amount of credit that accesses, that allows you to access that education up to a limit of how you spend it. But why would the government preference a dentist over an engineer over an art student?
Indeed. So once again, in terms of the reimagining, where are you in your journey of reimagining higher education?
What I'm trying to achieve is effective blended learning. So you've got, like many months ago, back in the 2020, I asked students how to work. They wanted online face-to-face, small groups, big lectures. It was a pie chart. It was an equal distribution with about 6 chunks. And it was no one bag, which meant that it's horses for courses. It depends on whether you are a youth student who is interested in, like, an off-campus lifestyle, or whether you're a mother of three students mother of three kids who's unemployed and wants to improve their life through the acquisition of a degree and has to study online. People want different ways and different modalities, and there is no one size fits all. So what I'm trying to do right now in terms of imagination is porosity between the online and face-to-face timetable and modalities to make it seamless to move between them. And I think if I can do that, that'll satisfy student choice. That's a non-trivial exercise because timetables get baked in and they're very hard to unbake. But that's the next nut I'd like to crack, because I think that affords people the ability to access education in a way that suits them, not the way that the education institution determines should suit.
So to achieve that, you'll also have to educate the people that work in the university.
Sure.
And you'll have to re-socialise them to different ways of thinking, different ways of understanding the world, but also being able to see themselves in this reimagining. Have you got any ideas about how you can do that?
That's all about dialogue and communication. It's actually about, as you say, it's about a re-education. It's about repeating the message many times, demonstrating that there's an evidence base for why you're doing what you're trying to do. And it starts with the articulation that more than half of our students are non-school leavers. So they don't operate on a Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, 9 to 5 timetable. They operate on a 24/7 basis. They want to access education because it fits into their lifestyle. And the more in which we can demonstrate and actually hold up the personas of our learners, the greater affiliation and identification there is between the educator and the student. And they can realise that as they're delivering what they're delivering, it's still a bit of benefits to the student. And I think it becomes one of asynchronous core content and synchronous intensives. Those intensives can either be in the classroom or in the panel online. Once we can crack timetable, that's where the law falls.
Well, it's timetable and workload.
Yeah. Well, workload is a finite thing. So, I mean, ideally, you'd be able to actually have all people in employment work at different hours. Because fractionality is key business. So, flexibility on the work side is really important.
So, look, here's my last question. In fact, it's two questions in one. What advice would you give to your younger self? And then, what would you say to a senior leader who has aspirations of becoming even more senior?
I think if I was going to give myself some advice, I would have told myself to ditch the tie earlier in my career, because it's just not really me. I'm going to be authentic. I don't think I'm interested in suit and tie for as long as I did. I think for an emerging leader, I think it's about first of all, never curb your enthusiasm, because oftentimes enthusiasm gets curbed because you feel you ought to be deferential or, I guess, overtly respectful for an alternative point of view because of a perception of seniority or experience that may not be there. So enthusiasm is fine, as long as you know that self-belief is really important. So I think not being afraid to articulate your perspective because of and maintaining your integrity. Articulating that's incredibly important. That would be the advice to the emerging leader, and don't worry about it.
And the final thing that you should probably add there is don't lose your sense of humour.
No, because it's critically important.
Going back to the very beginning of the Jane Goodall cartoon. David, look, thank you for spending time with me this afternoon. I have done work with you and for you at UniSA, and so I hold it in the highest regard. And everything you've said to me, it's the David that I know and admire. So thank you very much.
That's it.
And enjoy your afternoon.
Visit studiosity.com/studentsfirst for the next Students First Symposium, an open forum for faculty, staff and academics to candidly discuss and progress the issues that matter most in higher education. studiosity.com/studentsfirst